Welcome to Life Stories, where we share inspiring tales of resilience, hope, and transformation. Today, we bring you a story about a young millionaire named Ryan, whose life takes an unexpected turn when he encounters Sarah, a homeless girl struggling to find her way. What begins as an act of kindness grows into a powerful journey of self-discovery, empathy, and the impact one person can have on another's life. Join us as we explore how two individuals, from vastly different worlds, come together and change each other's destinies. Please subscribe to Life Stories and let's begin today's story. Ryan Mitchell sat behind the wheel of his sleek black car, driving through the rain-soaked streets of Los Angeles. The rhythmic drumming of the downpour against the windshield seemed to mirror the chaotic thoughts that swirled in his mind. He was well acquainted with the sound, the sensation of rain drowning out the world, muffling everything around him. The city that had once been his playground now felt empty and distant. And the streets were strangely deserted under the storm's relentless assault. Streetlights blinked weakly in the foggy haze, and water streaked down the windows, blurring the view outside. Los Angeles, bustling and full of life by day, was now a shadow of itself, a ghost town in the heavy storm. Ryan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw set in frustration. The hum of classical music played softly through the car's sound system, but it failed to soothe the gnawing emptiness inside him. He had just left another networking gala, a lavish affair that had once filled him with satisfaction. But tonight was different. The usual sense of accomplishment he felt after sealing deals and making connections felt hollow, as though he were an actor watching himself play the role of the self-made millionaire. The glitzy chatter of the event, filled with empty words and superficial smiles, had felt more like a performance than a genuine interaction. And now, as he maneuvered through the damp streets, the sense of alienation had only grown. As the car stopped at a red light, Ryan's eyes wandered to the sidewalk. Beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, he noticed a figure huddled under the awning of a boarded-up shop. A young woman. Her frame was thin, almost fragile, and she was wrapped in a tattered coat that looked inadequate against the harshness of the storm. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, and strands of wet hair clung to her pale face, her eyes staring blankly ahead, as though the storm outside had long since matched the one within her. For a moment, Ryan's gaze lingered on her. He had seen homelessness before, countless times in a city like Los Angeles. But something about this girl, the way her shoulders trembled against the cold, the desperate emptiness in her gaze, rooted him in place. He felt a strange flicker of recognition deep within him, a feeling that he couldn't quite place. The light turned green, and the car behind him honked impatiently. Ryan's foot hovered over the gas pedal. He could have just driven away, as he had done countless times before, telling himself it wasn't his problem. But this time, something tugged at him, something he couldn't ignore. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he pressed the gas, surging forward through the wet streets. "Not my problem," he muttered under his breath, trying to shake the image of the girl from his mind. But as he drove, her face lingered. The image refused to fade. A block later, Ryan slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest, not from fear, but from the internal war raging within him. "Damn it," he muttered to himself as he shifted into reverse. His car slid slightly on the wet pavement as he parked along the curb, stepping out into the icy rain. The cold bit through his tailored suit as he approached the girl, who hadn't noticed him yet. He called out to her, his voice rougher than he intended. "Hey," he said, his tone harsh with urgency. The girl flinched, her wide eyes snapping up to meet his, her body tensing, ready to flee. She looked like a cornered animal, unsure of his intentions. Ryan quickly raised his hands in a gesture of peace, trying to calm her. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "You're going to freeze out here. Do you have somewhere to go?" The girl hesitated, her lips trembling as she shook her head. "I'll be fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Her response made it clear she didn't trust him. Ryan felt a pang of frustration bubble up inside him, mixed with something deeper he couldn't quite name. "No, you won't," he shot back, surprising even himself with the force of his words. His hand ran through his damp hair as frustration surged within him. Look, I'm not asking you to trust me. But you can't stay here. Come with me, just for the night. She eyed him cautiously, suspicion flashing across her face. Why would you care? She asked, her voice soft but tinged with disbelief. Ryan hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he had expected. Why did he care? He didn't know her. She was a stranger, nothing more than a fleeting image in the storm. Yet beneath the cynicism and the walls he had built around himself, he felt a deep sense of recognition, a memory of his own past, a time when he, too, had been cold, desperate, searching for any glimmer of hope. I just do, he said quietly. Finally, take it or leave it. The girl stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded cautiously, as if taking a leap of faith she wasn't entirely ready for. Ryan shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened as he led her to the car, her body hunched as if she were bracing for an inevitable blow. The silence in the car was thick, filled with an unspoken tension. Ryan drove in silence, his mind racing. He had no idea why he was doing this. He had no idea why this girl, this stranger, had suddenly become so important to him. After a few minutes, he turned to her. What's your name? He asked, trying to break the silence. Sarah, she said softly, her voice small. Well, Sarah, Ryan continued, trying to sound casual. You look like you could use a hot meal and a dry place to sleep. My place isn't far. His words felt hollow, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. He needed to get her out of the storm, away from the cold. He needed to do something. As they drove, Sarah glanced at him, her eyes still wary, but there was something different now. A flicker of hope, perhaps? Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't have an answer. Not a good one. Let's just say someone once helped me when I needed it most. He replied, his voice rough. Maybe it's time I paid it forward. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive. As the car pulled up to Ryan's sprawling Beverly Hills townhouse, Sarah's eyes widened. She looked at the house in disbelief, as if unable to comprehend that someone like her could belong in a place like this. This is your house? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Yeah, Ryan said, stepping out of the car and motioning for her to follow. Come on. As they entered the warmth of the house, Sarah lingered near the door, unsure of her place in such an unfamiliar world. Ryan grabbed a blanket from a nearby closet and tossed it to her. You can take the couch, he said, his voice softer now. The bathroom's down the hall if you need it. I'll get you some dry clothes. Thank you, Sarah murmured quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan gave her a small nod before retreating upstairs to his room. Lying in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. He had opened his door to a stranger, someone he didn't know, someone he couldn't control, and yet, it felt as though his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. The next morning, Ryan awoke to the quiet hum of the city, but his mind was far from calm. The events of the previous night replayed in his thoughts like a persistent loop. He had taken a risk, letting a stranger into his home, but the feeling of unease had already settled within him. He couldn't help but wonder what had led him to make such a decision. Why had he cared so much? And why couldn't he shake the image of Sarah, sitting there on his couch, fragile yet somehow unbroken? When he descended the stairs later, he found Sarah sitting on the couch, wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given her. She was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Her wet hair had dried overnight, but she still looked fragile, vulnerable. It seemed as if she was waiting for something, a sign. Maybe, or even just a moment to exhale. Morning, Ryan said softly, trying to break the silence. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wary, as if she was unsure of what to expect. But she nodded in acknowledgement. He cleared his throat. Are you hungry? I can make you something. Sarah hesitated, then nodded faintly. Just some coffee would be fine, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan moved toward the kitchen, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. As he prepared coffee, he couldn't help but observe the girl from the corner of his eye. Her wariness, her hesitation, it all reminded him of himself. He wasn't someone who trusted easily. If at all, the walls he had built around himself were high, fortified by years of fighting for everything he had earned. He had learned, early on, that the world owed him nothing. It was something he had accepted, something he had lived by. As he handed Sarah a cup of coffee, he found himself asking, "What's your story?" It was a question that felt natural. But the moment the words left his mouth, Ryan knew it was more than just casual curiosity. He wanted to understand, to know what had led her to this point. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she took the mug, her gaze dropping to the floor. She seemed to struggle for a moment, searching for the right words. When she spoke, it was slow, as though she had carried this burden for too long. I left home about a year ago, she began, her voice steady but hollow. My stepfather, he wasn't a good man. And my mom, she chose him over me. Ryan's jaw tightened at the words. He had heard similar stories before. Stories of broken families, of betrayal and pain. But they never failed to strike a nerve. His father had walked out when he was just 6, leaving his mother to struggle. She had worked multiple jobs just to put food on the table, while he worked tirelessly to survive. The difference was that he had been given a chance to rebuild, to rise above his circumstances. Sarah had not. I thought I could make it on my own, she continued, her voice quiet but firm. But it's harder than I thought. Jobs don't come easy when you don't have an address. And shelters, they're not always safe. Ryan's heart ached as he listened. Her words reminded him of his own desperation, of the times when he had been at his lowest, wondering if anyone would ever care enough to help. But what struck him the most was the way Sarah had tried to survive. On her own terms. She hadn't asked for charity. She hadn't begged for help. She had simply endured. You don't trust me, she said suddenly, her eyes meeting his, piercing through his carefully constructed walls. Ryan blinked, caught off guard. What makes you say that? He asked, genuinely confused. You keep watching me like you're waiting for me to steal something, she said, her voice bitter with the truth. He let out a humorless laugh, unable to deny it. Can you blame me? He muttered. I don't make a habit of bringing strangers into my home. Sarah's lips curved into a faint, almost bitter smile. Fair enough, she said, her eyes darting away. Ryan's gaze softened, his mind racing. You know, he began, his tone gentler. Most people wouldn't even look at you, let alone help you. I know, Sarah replied, her voice laced with quiet resignation. Most people don't even see me. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ryan felt a pang of guilt wash over him. How many times had he walked past people on the streets, ignoring their pain, telling himself that it wasn't his problem? Yet, here he was, doing something he hadn't even known he was capable of. Why did you leave? Ryan asked, his voice low and thoughtful. If you don't mind me asking. Sarah stiffened slightly, her shoulders tensing. I thought I could make it on my own, she replied, her tone hardening. But, it's not that simple. Ryan studied her, feeling a strange sense of connection, as if they were both standing on the edge of something they didn't fully understand yet. They were both survivors, fighting to carve out a place in a world that had never been kind to them. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan realized that Sarah wasn't just a stranger. She was a reminder of the person he used to be, the person he had buried deep inside himself. You're not alone anymore, he said quietly, his voice firm. I'm here. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and doubt. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered. Ryan's heart softened, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. You're not a burden, he said, his voice steady, and you don't have to do this alone. As the silence settled around them, Ryan realized that the girl sitting before him was more than just someone he had helped. She was someone who had reminded him of the importance of empathy, of opening his heart to others, even when it was the hardest thing to do. Over the next few weeks, things began to change for both Ryan and Sarah. The awkward silence between them slowly dissolved into a quiet understanding, a shared space where they both learned to trust each other. Sarah, still adjusting to life in Ryan's world, had begun to find her footing. She helped around the house when she could, and Ryan made sure she was always comfortable, never treating her as though she owed him anything. One evening, as they sat in Ryan's expansive living room, Sarah picked up an old sketchbook she had found on a shelf. Its pages yellowed and worn from years of neglect. She flipped through it hesitantly, her eyes glancing over the rough drawings she had made years ago. Ryan, who had been watching her quietly, noticed the way her fingers traced the lines as though they were familiar. Like an old friend. "What is it?" Ryan asked. His curiosity piqued. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She seemed lost in her own thoughts. Her eyes focused on the sketches. Finally, she closed the book and looked at him. "It's nothing," she said softly, as though trying to dismiss the talent she'd once cherished. "Just a hobby." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "A hobby?" he repeated. He leaned forward, intrigued. "Sarah, these are incredible." She shrugged, embarrassed. "It's just something I used to do when I was younger. But it's not like it's useful or anything. I can't make a career out of it." Ryan sat up straighter, his expression serious. "Don't sell yourself short. This is more than just a hobby. You have real talent. Have you ever thought about pursuing it seriously?" Sarah looked down, as if the idea was foreign to her. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted quietly. "Besides, I have enough to worry about." Ryan studied her for a moment. Her reluctance was understandable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she had something special, something that deserved to be seen by the world. He leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Well, when you're ready," he said softly, "I'll help you however I can. Don't let this talent slip away because you're afraid it's not practical. The world could use more of what's in here." He tapped the sketchbook gently, his voice unwavering. Sarah's gaze softened, and she nodded. "I'll think about it," she said, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. As the days passed, Ryan found himself increasingly captivated by Sarah's quiet strength. She wasn't like the people he usually surrounded himself with. There was no pretense about her, no hidden agendas or self-serving motives. She had been through so much, yet she had retained a part of herself that was unbroken, untainted by the hardships she had faced. One afternoon, as Ryan was preparing for a business meeting, he noticed Sarah standing by the window, looking out over the city. She was holding the sketchbook again, flipping through the pages with a slow reverence. Ryan couldn't help but watch her from across the room. She was different now, more confident, though still cautious. "Are you ready to show the world what you can do?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence. Sarah turned to him, surprised by the question. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing the edges of the sketchbook. "I don't know. It's scary," she admitted, her voice small. "I'm not sure I'm ready." Ryan smiled, stepping toward her. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try. I'm here to help you." Over the following weeks, Ryan made good on his promise. He introduced Sarah to some of his contacts, people who could help her get her art into the world. Together, they organized a small art exhibit in downtown Los Angeles. Ryan used his influence, and Sarah found herself surrounded by people who saw her work and admired it. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt seen, not as the girl who had fallen through the cracks, but as an artist with something valuable to offer. On the night of the exhibit, Ryan stood off to the side, watching Sarah interact with the guests. She looked different now, confident, radiant even. She moved through the crowd with ease, her eyes lighting up as people complimented her work. Ryan couldn't help but feel a swell of pride in his chest. Later, as the evening wound down, Sarah found Ryan standing near the entrance, a quiet smile on his face. She approached him, her expression one of disbelief. "I can't believe this is real," she said softly. All of this." Ryan grinned, his heart swelling. "You did this, Sarah. All of it. I just helped you see it." She smiled, the gratitude evident in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "I never would have believed in myself if you hadn't believed in me first." Ryan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. You've earned every bit of this." He paused, then added, "You've changed your life. I just helped you get there." Sarah looked down, a small smile tugging at her lips. She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "And you've changed mine, Ryan, more than you know." As the night came to a close, Ryan realized that this journey, the one they had taken together, had transformed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had always been driven, focused on success and control. But Sarah had shown him something different. She had reminded him that true success wasn't about money or power. It was about connection, about seeing the potential in someone, even when they couldn't see it themselves. And for the first time in years, Ryan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the weeks passed, Ryan and Sarah's lives intertwined in ways neither had expected. They both grew, each finding strength in the other. Ryan learned that helping someone else find their path was more rewarding than any deal or business success. Sarah, on the other hand, discovered her own worth, realizing that her past didn't define her future. With Ryan's unwavering belief in her, she not only found her voice as an artist but also reclaimed her confidence. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of Ryan's penthouse, watching the city lights stretch out before them, Sarah turned to Ryan, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I never thought I'd be here," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Ryan smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're exactly where you're meant to be." Sarah's gaze softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Ryan's heart swelled with emotion. He had given her a chance. But it was Sarah who had done the hard work. She had fought for herself, for her dreams, and for a future she once thought was out of reach. As they stood there, side by side, Ryan realized that the journey they had taken together was just the beginning. It wasn't just about changing one life. It was about the transformation that happens when we show up for others, when we believe in each other, and when we choose love and kindness over everything else. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the Life Stories channel for more inspiring tales of resilience, love, and hope. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.